The Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. And yesterday we started a discussion based off of a teaching from Dr. Gary Busick about the fact that it's not 1964 anymore. And what that meant was that there's a lot of things that have changed in the culture and a lot of things that have changed in the methods for the church in order for it to be effective in evangelism. And so today we're going to take a look at what does evangelism look like and what do we need to be able to do to reach people for Christ. So Pastor Rob, welcome back in.
Yeah, thank you. This is a really good conversation for us to have. And I hope that yesterday was kind of a eye-opener for us a little bit in just the fact that we don't live in the same culture, and because we don't live in the same culture that our parents or we grew up in, maybe we need to understand that. There's a guy named Leslie Newbegin, and he was a missionary to India from Great Britain. He left Great Britain, went to India, and he served there for many years. And then after serving as a missionary in India, he was ready to retire or was done with his term, and it was a long time, came back to England. And when he came back to England, he looked at the world that he left and said, this is a different place.
Yeah.
And so it's hard for us to see the changes that happen in culture because we're like the frog that's getting cooked in the water, right?
That's exactly what I was thinking.
You drop a frog in boiling water and he's going to jump out. But if you put a frog in water and you just turn it up 1 degree every little bit, eventually he just gets so comfortable and he gets boiled. So we're living in the culture that's changed gradually over time, and we've accepted and adapted to those changes. But when you go away, like Leslie did for maybe, I think it was 30 years, and you come back, you see the changes. And he says, this isn't the same country that I left when I went to India to be a missionary. And he began analyzing it and studying it, and he talked about how it was really a post-Christian culture. And if you like, England and Canada kind of are a little bit ahead of us in the curve of
right.
The spiritual temperature or climate. And so what's happening there, what has happened there is happening here. So we're kind of following the process of unchristianization. That's not a word. Becoming post-Christian.
There we go.
Yeah,
we'll go with that.
And so he talked about that, and he said what had happened. He said is that the country that he left isn't the same anymore, and he realized that if he was going to be effective at winning other people, new people to the Lord and sharing the gospel, that he had to come at it with a missionary mindset. He said, like, my country is a mission field. And something that happened just a few years ago in the Church of the Nazarene is that the Church of the Nazarene declared the USA and Canada a mission field. Mm-hmm. And when I was growing up, we were the people who sent missionaries to other countries, and that's not the case anymore. I mean, the church is growing faster all over the world than it is here in the United States, and part of that is because of the cultural changes that have happened in our country. That whether we realize or recognize it or not, because we live in it and it's been slow, it has changed drastically. Like we live in a culture that is unlike any other culture. In fact, there are a couple things that I said yesterday that I was in this class, and I'm learning some things on preaching or whatever. But one of the things that we learned in this was that the Western culture, which is the culture we live in, is the most dangerous rival that the church has faced ever. Like the things that have happened, we were preaching in this series in 1 Peter, and we talk about the persecution that the church faced. That wasn't as bad to Christendom as the culture that we live in today. Because what's happened is we've tried to live in sync with the culture. The church has tried to live in sync with the culture. It's a thing called syncretism, and what it basically means is that we've tried to reflect the culture in the church. And so as a result of the church trying to reflect the culture, we don't stand out anymore, and we don't make a difference. The church is just like the culture. So when people look at the church, they're like, you don't have anything different to offer than what I'm already getting in the culture. Why would I come to the church? You don't live differently. You don't act differently. You don't You don't believe differently. You kind of believe the same things, do the same things. Why would I come there? Because what's happened is that the church has become a part of culture. And so Dr. Busick says, like, the Western culture is the most dangerous rival the church has faced ever. Like, that's a massive statement.
Yeah. And one of the things that he started to get into that really gave me a fresh look at it is that he's realizing that when you go to a pagan culture, they've not heard the gospel. So when they hear it, they're more ripe for a harvest because they're hearing the good news.
Yeah.
One of the reasons Western culture is so dangerous is because it's a culture that knew Christianity and has since rejected it.
Yeah.
And so now you're coming back in trying to evangelize a culture that has, in one sense, rejected this faith.
Well, it's like we've been inoculated.
Yes.
I mean, it's exactly what's happened because, when you go to get a vaccine, you get a little bit of the disease that allows your system to build up a resistance to it. So then when you're exposed to the real thing in the real world, your body has a defense system against it and you don't get it. And this is what's happened. We've been inoculated with Christianity. We've heard the stories, we've seen it, but it's not changed our life. We say we're Christian, but we don't change our life. And so people look at Christians and say, well, your life isn't any different than mine. I really don't need that.
That is a great analogy. As you were saying it, I was thinking about how a vaccine actually works. A traditional vaccine is like a weaker version of the actual disease in order to cure you or to give you a defense. And that's part of the problem in the Western culture is that the Christianity that this culture has been feeding on for so long is a weaker version of the real gospel.
Yeah.
And so now that they're somewhat, quote unquote, immune to being evangelized.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the other thing that Dr. Busick said was that Western culture is the most resistant to Christian faith, and we would be resistant to it because we've seen a little weaker version of it, and it hasn't changed anybody. So we become more resistant to it. And all of this is in the context of the conversation that says, how do I win my neighbor who doesn't know Jesus to the Lord?
Right.
I mean, or how do I win people that I don't know? Do I go down my road and knock on the door and say, if you were to die tonight and stand before Jesus and he says, why should I let you into heaven? What are you going to say? They're going to slam the door in your face. So what's happened is that we have to figure out how can we take this gospel message, the real gospel message that's undiluted, and see it changing people's lives. It just was something that kind of rocked me. He says that here without question is the most challenging missionary frontier of our time, the Western culture. Like and when I heard all of those things, it was somewhat, what's the word I'm looking for? Objectify. I don't think that's the right word. It just made me feel like, oh, okay, I'm not crazy. Because in my life,
you were being validated.
Validate is the word, yeah. Because in my life, like I've been in ministry for a long time. I remember times when I could walk up to teenagers and just talk to them about God. There's sometimes you can do that, but it's different today. You just can't walk up to people and those kind of things. And so it was like to hear that we're living in a missionary culture, a mind that has a mindset that's resistant to the gospel was like validating. It was like, oh, well, that's why it's so hard to do ministry today. That's, and people would say like, well, you just need to get the bus out and start going down the road again, or you just need to start going door to door. I'm like, no, that's not how we win this culture. We win this culture by sharing the gospel, the undiluted, powerful gospel, but we have to deliver it in a method that is different than we did in the past because that method doesn't work anymore.
I want to live like you and see people how you see them.
I want your mission to be my mission.
I don't want to shrink back from the big questions. Help me to listen deeply as you would.
God, so many things try to hold us back, but let your love speak louder than fear.
By your Spirit, Lord, remind me I don't have to be who I'm not.
I can connect compassionately out of who you made me to be, even out of my brokenness.
Lead me as I share the simple gospel.
Refresh me in the midst of resistance.
fill me with fresh vision for the next generation.
And let me know the joy of connecting the people you love back to you.
Fear and discouragement can cause us to shrink back from sharing the good news, but spiritual openness is rising in the U.S. God is calling us to remember why He sent His Son, not to condemn the world, but to save it. If you'd like to learn more how to share your faith or sharpen up your skills on how to share Jesus with others, please join Pastor Rob starting Wednesday, April 3rd in the sanctuary for an 8-week class on sharing your faith. This 8-part video-driven course is full of inspiring stories and actionable challenges from 18 amazing contributors. This whole discussion that we had yesterday and so far today, it shouldn't be misread as though we're boo-hooing about it's not like the good old days, and so therefore we just give up. This is just looking at it as objectively as possible, analyzing our methods and saying what needs to change in order to be effective.
Yeah. Well, when Dr. Busick was sharing all of this, he talks about, all these things and how culture is resistant to it, and we're living in a missionary frontier. He even says this is the most powerful, pervasive, dangerous resistance to the gospel the church has ever faced. And I'm like, that's exciting to me, to live in that kind of time frame when we have the opportunity to make a difference in the most resistant culture ever. But it's hard.
Right.
Also. Right. But the thing that he said was because the church is living in this state of syncretism where we want to be so much like the culture, he says the problem isn't as much the culture as it is the church. Mm-hmm. He's like, the problem is the church. We've allowed the culture to become so primary in our narrative that we're accommodating people and rather than challenging people.
Yeah.
And challenging people is hard because it offends them. It makes them uncomfortable. It makes us uncomfortable. We don't like offending people, but nobody's life ever gets changed unless they're confronted with the gospel. Last week, the week before Easter, Craig Rochelle, who's a pastor of a large church, lots of churches actually, he put out a video to pastors just to be an encouragement to them. And I didn't watch the video, but I read the subtitle, and the subtitle was, "It's Not All on You." And the idea that I know what he was communicating, the idea is that, it's going to be Easter Sunday, there's going to be a lot of people in your church, and it's not on you to save them. It's the gospel.
Right.
Your job is to put the gospel out there, and the gospel is what changes people's lives. The gospel is what it forgives people and brings them into a right relationship with God. You didn't die for them. Jesus did. Just preach the gospel and let the gospel do its job. And that's what the church has not done. We've just not done a good job sharing the gospel. When I say the church, I don't necessarily mean in our church services. I mean the way that the people who make up the church have lived in the culture.
The movement of the church.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And so what we have to do is we have to pray, right? We have to stop trying to fit the church into the culture. I have a quote that says, "Instead of confronting the culture with the gospel, we're trying to fit the gospel into our culture, which makes us captive to the culture." And what he's saying is let's quit trying to be culturally whatever, and let's just take the gospel to the culture and let the gospel do what it has the power to do, which is change and transform lives. And I love that. But the idea that he's speaking about is I have to do it with a missionary stance and a missionary mindset. And so he obviously talks about praying. So we need to pray. We need to reclaim the power of the gospel. As a pastor, I just need to remember that people getting saved isn't on how good of a sermon I preach. It's on the gospel. I just got to put the gospel out there. And then the good news of what Jesus did is what changes people's lives, and the Holy Spirit. And it's the same with us one-on-one when we're trying to win people at work or people who we go to school with or our neighbors or our family members. It's not on you to have an eloquent presentation. It's not on you to have a great testimony. It's on you sharing the gospel, letting the gospel do it. He quoted something from Martin Luther who said this, and I love this. He says, "The gospel is like a caged lion. It need not be defended, just released."
Nice.
And I'm like, oh, that's powerful, man. It's like kick butt Christianity right there.
Yep.
Yeah, I love that. So he's like, we got to pray. We got to reclaim the power of the gospel and just have this commitment to holiness discipleship. And then recover our missional DNA, which means that we need to figure out how we can take this gospel and deliver it to the people in the culture that are 2s instead of 8s.
Yeah.
Right? How do we do that? But
I was just thinking as you were talking about this missional mindset and really thinking of, where we live as a mission field. When I look at what missionaries do, they don't go in with the mindset of like, I'm going to this foreign country and I'm going to change their culture. What they do is they figure out how do I communicate with this person? How can I speak their language? How can I talk to them?
Well, a large part of a missionary's training is to learn the language.
And what we've been trying to do, I think, with good intention, but many times what happens is the idea of we start looking at, it's not 1964 anymore, and we start thinking of all the things that have changed, and it's a temptation to go start barking at the culture and saying, we need to go back and be more like this, and we need to go back.
Or we need to get the buses back out and go door to door or whatever.
And we end up just having an argument with culture, and then Jesus still gets lost in the midst of all that instead of staying focused on what is the mission.
Yeah. Well, the good, we can wrap it up with this, because there's a lot of good news. There's I love the fact that we are living in what sociologists would call the most resistant time to the gospel, which means that we have an opportunity that no one else in the church has had to bring the gospel to a very hard-hearted culture. But the good news is that when the gospel penetrates a hard heart, the change that happens is amazing.
Yeah.
And there's a guy named J.D. Wall. He says this. He says, the stage is being set for another great awakening. He says, rather than continue to lament the loss of Christian America, it's time to reclaim our New Testament nerve and recover our apostolic mojo.
Nice.
I mean, it's like, and that's what it's about. That's what we've got to do. And so we're going to have this class, and we'll talk about it tomorrow, which actually starts tomorrow. We're going to have this class it's called an evangelism masterclass, but it's really a class about how to share your faith in this culture that we live in. And there are lots of ways to share your faith, and we'll talk about some of that tomorrow in the class. But and then if you haven't had the opportunity to come to the class, you don't even have to sign up, just show up. But I think it'll be an encouragement to you to learn how we can share our faith and begin to get the gospel into the culture.
All right. Well, that's what we're going to do. So tomorrow, we're going to get a little bit into a description of what these classes are going to be like.
Yeah.
And they'll actually start on Wednesday evening. So that's going to be tomorrow at 6:30 that the classes will start. They're going to be meeting in the sanctuary. You're welcome to come. You can also email us at podcast@shepnaz.org if you want some more details or if you have some questions. You can also follow along with everything that's going on at the church by going to the church website, which is shepnaz.org. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.